So whenever I speak about Sousa at a conference like this, something interesting always happens. So hang on to your hats. I did this presentation a few months ago for Iowa music educators, and a very nice lady came up to me afterwards and said, I play in the Carl King Band in Fort Dodge, and my parents both played for Mr. King for years. I'm thinking, yes, and she says, and your presentation was spot on. Everything you said was correct. And so I suppose I should have been flattered, but really the only emotion I felt at that point was relief. Okay, great, thank you very much. I did another presentation on Sousa a few years ago. In Oberschutz, and I believe, John, you've been there, at the university satellite campus out there. And we're all seated before the conference, all the presenters at a table getting to know each other. And I'm talking to this very nice lady next to me, and we're getting to know each other. And in preparation for the presentation, I had read Pat Warfield's Sousa biography, pretty much everything that Pat had written on the subject. Many of you probably know Pat. He's the director of the School of Music at University of Minnesota. And so, she and I are talking, and she says to me, "Oh, you're here to do the Sousa presentation." I said, "Yes, I am." She said, "Well, then you probably know my husband, Pat Warfield." I turn around, and I'm introduced to him. We're about as close as I am to this screen right now, and I'm about to get up and talk about John Philip Sousa in front of him. And so I relay that to my students all the time on the subject of, well, how prepared should you be? To get up and conduct or to get up and do something like this. You can never be prepared enough. So I give the presentation and No. It's like, I have no answers for you whatsoever. But he had raised his hand to say it was a very good presentation and to ask me for the source of one of my quotations. I'd quoted him in the presentation, for crying out loud. So we don't know what's going to happen today. Could be something interesting, could be routine. This is a shortened version of a 1-hour presentation, which is a shortened version of a 2-hour presentation. So I'm going to cut some of it. I'm going to cut a lot of the audio. I'm willing to bet that a lot of people in this room specifically are familiar with a lot of this material, but hopefully it'll be a nice summation for you. So the Sousa effect is what I've chosen to title this. It came from this quotation from a journalist in South Africa during the Sousa Band's 1911 world tour that said, quote, "Sousa's marches have been done to death. But as soon as the band struck up El Capitan, one realized that one had never heard a Sousa march played before. There is a vim about the Sousa march as played by the Sousa Band that sets the blood a-tingling, and you feel that you could march anywhere to such virile music." So what effect must that live performance of a Sousa march as played by the Sousa Band have produced? Sousa did not discuss the techniques and rehearsal strategies that produce this effect, nor are they discernible on the printed page. If you look at the original publications of these pieces, it's everyone, the whole tutti ensemble playing at the same time with no rests in the individual parts. But we know that's not how they were performed. Bass drummer August Helmecke posits that Sousa, quote, refrained from writing these in because he didn't want any other band to play the marches the way he did. Flutist Joseph Lefter relates a personal anecdote corroborating this theory. Quote, "I asked Sousa one time why he changed his music when he played it in the marches. He told me, 'Mr. Lefter, if everyone played it the way it's written, then everybody's band would sound like Sousa's band.'" Cornetist and conductor Leonard B. Smith, we've heard that name already, describes another possible motivation for this practice. Quote, "As a matter of pride, conductors and players alike would purposely not indicate these effects on the parts, but instead memorize them." After Sousa's death, however, his associates disclosed many of these trade secrets to ensure fidelity to his legacy. Now that he is gone, Helmecke explained, he would want those marches played as he played them. This presentation was born out of my research into Frank Simon and the work I did with the Frank Simon Archives at University of Arizona, thanks to Frank Simon and the interviews that he provided in the 1960s for the Sounds of John Philip Sousa recordings made in conjunction with the American School Band Directors Association. It was Frank Simon who provided us with the most substantive documentation of march performance practice that we have. So you're going to hear Frank Simon's name a lot too. So this is basically a survey of rehearsal considerations and performance practices that have been transmitted through the generations, mostly orally, but also in recent years thanks to people like Keith Bryan and others. So let's dive right in. Tempo considerations. For most of his career, Sousa performed his marches at 116 to 120 beats per minute. Maybe a little slower than you hear them today, consistent with the United States Department of Defense's official march tempo of 120 beats per minute. Did you know that that's where that tempo comes from? The government. It's the U.S. Department of Defense. In the 1920s, when the government approved tempo increased to 128, I don't know, Sousa accelerated his to as fast as 132. In 1933, the year after Sousa's death, the official tempo reverted to 120 beats a minute. So for me, this implies some sort of latitude for our interpretations today, though steadiness of tempo must assume priority over speed. Sousa's tuba players added a gogic weight to the downbeat of each measure, mimicking the left-right cadence of marching feet. And that's an easy one to incorporate, even for your youngest performers. This technique reinforced in the bass drum, maintained tempo while providing impetus for the upbeats in the horns and snare drum. Sousa and his contemporaries observed that proper placement of accented notes is essential to maintaining consistent tempo. Sousa clarinetist Roy Miller explains, quote, "Most bands rush accents. Sousa's bands played accents exactly in time, which made them seem late." There's also a caution up here about not rushing 6/8. Young bands especially have trouble with 6/8 because there is no solidly felt upbeat in 6/8 in compound time in general. So they tend to, I just said young bands, but it's really all bands, isn't it? Compress these compound subdivisions and rush 6/8 time. So just be careful. You see, Leonard Falcone was a major source for that. Without your encouraging them to hold back, the rhythms will feel rounded to them, and the tempo just tumbled forward. And then a big pet peeve of Mr. Sousa's and Mr. Simon's as well, the grandioso of a Sousa march is never to be taken slower. Grandioso is not a tempo indication, it's a stylistic indication. It means to play everything slightly broader. Simon said Mr. Sousa never slowed a march at the grandioso. So hearing the Stars and Stripes Forever in particular played that way these days would have irritated him to no end. So don't do that. Six eight. Another word on 6/8. Simon recommends that players elongate rests slightly to counteract the tendency to rush 6/8. Simon says, quote, "There is an extra hesitation at these spots, and it may take a while to teach your bands to do this, but the effort is well worthwhile. I guess you would call it cheating the rests. Just hold back a split second without tampering with the basic beat of the march." So as you can see, on the bottom, we're maintaining the underlying motor and hesitating ever so slightly before the accented note here on beat 2. All right, so just a slight hesitation in 6/8 following rests. One of many such examples in the literature. I'm gonna skip a couple of slides and a couple of audio examples, but they're out there if you'd ever like to see the whole thing. Let's talk about rhythms. Frank Simon said there's a disease in music education all over this land, and this disease is not insisting on the playing of proper note values. There seems to be a stigma against teaching good rhythm anymore. Yeah, that could have been written yesterday, but it was written in the 1960s. Dotted rhythms were a particular pet peeve of Simon's and especially Sousa's. And Arthur Pryor, it turns out, who in his article on playing marches gives the following examples. He cautions that sustaining notes for too long compresses and obscures shorter note values, while shortchanging note values distorts pulse over time. In 2/4 time, if you do not give full value to the dotted eighth notes, as you can see, you will add the value taken from the dotted eighth to the 16th, and the whole thing becomes tripletized. This is a phenomenon that those of us who work with bands hear almost daily, okay? So tripletizing these dotted rhythms. But similarly, in 6/8 time, Pryor says, give quarter notes their full value, otherwise you will add to the eighths what you have taken from the quarter. So in essence, kind of, the reverse happens when we're not audiating every eighth note in these compound patterns. We're adding to instead of taking from. Simon called dynamic contrast the most important thing in playing marches. Certainly Sousa's background in the theater and kind of his flair for all things theatrical, it seeped into his march compositions as well. And so, for dramatic effect and for overall contrast, of course, it almost goes without saying, but it really can't. That dynamic contrast, not just loud and soft, but all the gradations in between, is incredibly important. Most of us default to some sort of practice room mezzo forte. But louder louds, softer softs, more colors along the spectrum would be something that he definitely would have advocated. Sousa was a stickler for uniform articulations, and according to Simon, quote, spoke often about the attack in rehearsal. Now, since the terms staccato and marcato had different musical implications in Sousa's time than they do now, a lot of this was very much a holdover from the 19th century. Today's conductors must use context and intuition to determine the appropriate technique and the appropriate concept of sound. Contrary to modern usage of the term, Sousa used marcato to denote the space between notes rather than the attack itself. Okay. Simon defines staccato as detached, much shorter, and above all lighter than our modern understanding of the term. So staccato is light and detached. I still use that to define staccato. I don't know about you. This articulation creates lilt and allows firmly articulated notes, marcato, sforzando, etc., to exert maximum impact. It's the accents that I spoke about a few minutes ago. This is important. In the absence of printed articulations, all notes should be performed staccato. Sousa's manuscripts are nebulous, is the word I used here. Regarding accents, Frank P. Byrne explains, quote, Sousa apparently made no distinction in his handwritten manuscripts between the two different written accents, the marcato sign and the traditional accent sign. He uses them interchangeably. These seem to have been used at random throughout his manuscript score with no apparent consistency. So again, we as conductors have to use our intuition, have to use context, and have to determine which is appropriate at which time. Simon, in his liner notes to the Sounds of Sousa albums, mentions two gradations of marcato, a light marcato and a dark marcato. It may be a useful way of thinking about it for us as well, but a dark marcato is used to denote more power and more attack and space. And he says it gives the music more credence and rhythm. I don't know what that means. It's a harder articulation. It's more of a square note shape, and it's more well-defined in general. He mentions using that approach on the repeat, and the first time through, as we'll see when things are played lighter in general, to use a light marcato. make these markings fit the interpretations of the phrases. So the light and dark designation, I think, was something that was never anything that was made official, but seems to have helped him in performance. I don't know. The notion of phrasing from the beat versus toward the beat, our modern day notion of phrases as passages that peak, that ascend, peak, and recede. Pablo Casals called them rainbows, Our modern notion of phrase shapes is just that. It's incredibly modern and unique to the 20th century and beyond. Before that, players would phrase from the beat, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. But the goal was not to create that shape. The goal was this here, to find arrival points and to emphasize those. Stravinsky called them points of repose in his Poetics of Music, and to stress those. So this is right from Keith Bryan. This is the Thunderer Trio phrased from the beat. You see there's no actual musical destination in mind, as there would be according to our modern notion of what phrases look like and how they behave. Instead, we're emphasizing volume based on note length and weight, okay? If you actually kind of sing through that in your head, it's pretty foreign sounding to our modern musical sensibilities. Am I advocating that you perform this way necessarily? No, again, it's an intuition thing. It's important for us to know that this would have been the style in which a lot of this music would have been played, and to let it somehow inform our interpretive decisions, even as we may choose to stick with a more modern conception of phrasing, as defined by Casals and others later on. Now, in the 2-hour version of this presentation, I actually have a violinist with me to do some demonstrations, because I think everyone in this room probably knows Sousa was trained as a violinist and had extensive experience as one. At the age of 11, he led his own theater orchestra. He's quite accomplished. So without going too much into that, you should also know that he used the violin to compose, even at home where he had access to a piano. So all of his marches were conceived, if not with the violin in hand, then at least with the violin in mind. Sousa's soprano soloist, Blanche Dufield, describes watching him compose the Invincible Eagle in a trance-like state on a train to New York, okay? And here is what she swears happened. Quote, I tried to attract Mr. Sousa's attention, but it was not until he had picked out the march on a violin with his fingers, not a real violin, an imaginary violin, okay, like air guitar, put his notebook in his pocket, his violin in his case, his imaginary violin, okay, and his cigar back in his mouth, that he finally turned toward me and casually remarked that it was a very dark night outside. Okay, all right, that was someone who was clearly somewhere else for a while. So if he wasn't actually playing the violin, then he was conceiving of, well, the notes and probably the sound that way. So what I usually do in presenting this is, in advance, just give the violinist, we just use the first strain to Stars and Stripes Forever, which is essentially a fiddle tune if you think about it. With no prior instruction, I just tell them, to work it out as if it were, one of their recital pieces or something like that. And don't tell them to do anything further. And what they ultimately end up with is a kind of a beautiful, lifted, resonant approach. And here, I've written it out with a few notes. Perform marcato articulations as firm, resonant down bow strokes. Staccato articulation should replicate the lilt and buoyancy of off-the-string playing, okay? So if you are familiar with string instruments or know people who are, it's worth having the discussion because these marches were conceived this way. And if you're still unconvinced, I do hope to play this for you, actually. This is from YouTube, from some character on there, Taps Bugler. I don't know. But I should be able to click on this and should be able to play it for you, but it's not. Advance. Yeah, nope. Oh, that's too bad. This is really worth hearing. Maybe we can pull it up at the end? Yeah. Okay, hold that thought. Let me skip to this. I know we're over time here. This is kind of the secret sauce. It's not Thousand Island dressing, but this is how Sousa would have reorchestrated his marches and performance for maximum contrast and dramatic effect. I'm sure a lot of you know this, but the general public does not. My friends in Iowa were shocked and thrilled to learn this. Basically, intro and first strain, played as written. Second strain, first time reorchestrated and piano, piccolo flute, E-flat clarinet, cornets, trombones out in general, okay? Upper clarinets down the octave. Second time, tutti as written. Trio undergoes a similar reorchestration. Dogfight, battle, breakup strain, whatever you want to call it, played as written. Final strain, first time reorchestrated, second time tutti, play as written. And then I have here, what does the term stinger mean to you? Okay, something short and dry, not resonant and, so that would be very much in character as well. So I breeze over this because I assume this is familiar information. We'll talk about a couple of percussion considerations and then we'll be done. I show this picture to those who have never seen, well, it's a great picture, first of all, but to those who have never seen the bass drum with the attached cymbal setup, that's a really good view of that. Well, yeah, no, there's a lot to love in that picture, but yeah. Specifically, percussion equipment and technique. Sousa wrote for a 15-inch snare drum tuned to D4 to blend most effectively with the upbeats in the horns. Okay, that's not a misprint. We don't have 15-inch snare drums anymore. So how in the world do we replicate that? Keith Bryan suggests doubling a modern 13 or 14-inch snare drum with a field drum so that they're not heard as two separate instruments, but it is heard as something a little deeper and more resonant that 15-inch snare drum may have sounded like. Bass drum and crash cymbals, as you saw in the picture, were a single unit. They aren't played that way. They aren't played at the same time because they both resonate differently. So actually, it was quite difficult and more difficult than it appeared to perform as if, they were being played simultaneously. But modern day conductors should strive for that sort of blend between those two instruments, as if it were a single unit. Bells, sometimes, timpani, never, okay? Timpani parts were added into Sousa marches in the 1950s, well after his death, to accommodate school bands with extra percussionists, So don't ever use timpani in Sousa. He never wrote for them. In his marches, in his concert music, yes, okay. Gus Helmecki, don't overdo loudness. Percussionists should be especially careful about dynamics. I like this. Zeal is a beautiful thing, but not when it causes someone to pound drums and cymbals out of all musical proportion. I will not go too extensively into technique, other than to say that Sousa snare drummer John Haney, who published a book in the subject on the 1930s, advocates a very different technique than one which we might use today. He calls it a 5-stroke roll with a flam attack. Essentially, it is a 5-stroke roll with the arrival, the 6th stroke, the flam attack emphasized, and the same sticking throughout. So that's what I mean by rolls are not alternated. Again, just touching on a lot of this stuff. For the curious, here are Simon's written out rudiments for the final strain of Stars and Stripes Forever. So there's a lot of agreement here with Haney, even though these were written 30 years apart. This is essentially, not completely, but essentially a different way of notating what you just saw. So free resources, I think you're aware that all the Sousa Encore books are digitized on the Marine Band website. They provide not as much evidence as you might think individually of performance practice. You would kind of have to take them all together, which is quite a monumental task to notice the trends and whatnot that I've pointed out. But they are there and they're fascinating. The Complete Marches of John Philip Sousa is the Marine Band recording project that I believe is finished now. All of the Sousa marches plus brand new full scores and parts, with a lot of the reorchestrations that I mentioned and whatnot. They are completely free to download and play, okay? And then one that costs money, ASBDA, does still publish the Frank Simon pamphlet and recording, if you're interested in that as well. That was a lot in very little time. But if you ever want to talk Sousa, here's my contact info. So goodbye from me and goodbye from Mr. Sousa. And thank you, Kit, and everyone for making this possible. This is a lot of fun. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah.